Welcome to you all. For those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Brady Robards. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology in the School of Social Sciences. I'm very excited to see you all here for our event for Social Sciences Week on public trust in social media. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on this evening, the Boon Wurrung and the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. We extend that respect to any Aboriginal people who are here with us tonight, and we also acknowledge that we live and work on stolen land where sovereignty was never ceded. We also want to provide a general content warning for our discussion this evening. We will be talking about some challenging topics, including gendered violence and image-based abuse. To welcome you all this evening and to provide some context on Social Sciences Week more generally, I would like to introduce Professor Jo Lindsay. Jo is Associate Dean Enterprise of Monash's Faculty of Arts that is hosting us this evening, and also a Professor of Sociology in the School of Social Sciences. Welcome, Jo.
Thank you very much, Brady. It's so wonderful to see you all here. I'm delighted to welcome you all and to tell you a bit about Social Sciences Week. This is the second year that we have had Social Sciences Week, and it's an initiative to really get social science out there, social science knowledge out to decision makers, out to the public, and having much more of an influence than what it does. And so we started last year with 50 events and this year 60 events, and I'm really pleased to let you know that this morning I attended Parliamentary Friends of the Social Sciences. So this is a new initiative in Canberra across all of the parties talking about social science knowledge. And I just wanted to share a couple of aspects of that. Ken Henry, famous economist and public service, in his speech talked about the bridge between sources of expertise and decision makers being currently broken. And that having this Parliamentary Friends, having these initiatives where we try and get our ideas out there much more effectively is a way of building that bridge, I think. And Andrew Leigh, an MP, spoke about making politics more porous. And my job is really to work in the other direction. It's wonderful that politics could be more porous and more open to our ideas, but I think the academy also needs to be much more porous. And so I'm really hoping that, in fact, our ideas will flood out and that everybody, the public, are welcome to events like this and to Monash anytime. So I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks very much to Brady Robards and our colleague John Gardner, who organised this event, and I'm really looking forward to the insights that you're going to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. Yes, John unfortunately couldn't be with us tonight. He's on a plane coming home from LA at the moment, but he did do a lot of the work involved in organising tonight, so we really appreciate John's efforts. So, I want to introduce now our panel in a second, but before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the broad kind of strokes of the event. So it's a bit of a cliche in lots of ways, right, to talk about social media as embedded into our everyday lives. Of course, it has been for some time now. But it's still true for many people that oftentimes the first thing we do when we wake up in the morning and the last thing we do before we go to sleep is we're looking at social media. We're connected to each other through social media, to friends, to family. It's where we get news and learn about the world. And it's also increasingly an archive of personal memories. So people are reflecting on their own lives and their own personal histories through social media. It's, I guess, sites of relationships. It's where things like graduations and critical moments are recorded. It's where we see oftentimes baby photos of our nearest and dearest. We record weddings, we record personal achievements. But it also shadows trauma, experiences of loss, and the full gamut of human experiences. We find love and sex in dating and hookup apps like Gardner and Tinder. We build friendships through Snapchat, and we stay in touch with extended family in Messenger group chats. So it's complex and contested and really about human experience. At the same time, though, public trust in social media, companies, platforms more generally, has plummeted in the wake of data breaches and scandals about how our personal data is being used to profile us, to sell us things. And I'm not just talking about gadgets and travel and removalists, but things like ideas on who should be in power, on selling us on topics like climate change, on how we should think about asylum seekers and unemployed people. So the idea of us being profiled is much more complex than things being sold to us on an everyday sense. So how do we reconcile our reliance on the one hand with our distrust on the other? That's really what our event tonight is all about. How might the governance of social media platforms change in the future? What are some opportunities? What are some challenges? What are some practical solutions that we can think of for these issues around trust? Can social media actually play a role in a better future for us, for our society? So, joining me tonight, please come to the stage. I'm very excited to introduce you to some good colleagues of mine from Monash, from the School of Social Sciences and from Media, Film and Journalism. They can sit in any order they like, but this is them. Oh, you did self-organise. You did self-organise. Perfect. Well done. There you go. Very impressive. So first of all, on your left, Mark Andrejevic is a professor in communications and media studies here at Monash and an expert in the social and cultural implications of data mining and online monitoring. Mark's recent work is on the automation of surveillance and the cultural logics of big data. Next to Mark is Asher Flynn. Asher Flynn is an associate professor in criminology. Asher utilises a socio-legal framework to understand, critique and transform legal and policy practice in the areas of gendered and technology-facilitated violence. Asher's recent work has been on image-based abuse and non-consensual imagery, including important work on the nature and prevalence of revenge pornography. Stephen Roberts, who's sitting next to Asher. Steve is an associate professor in sociology. Steve is an expert on young people's transitions to adulthood and also the changing nature of men and masculinity, with a focus on class and inequality. Steve's recent work includes research on men's drinking cultures, and he has a new book out soon on masculinity and gaming on the social media platform Reddit. And then finally, Akane Kanai is a lecturer in communications and media studies. Akane explores changing practices of gender through media, spanning digital self-representation practices, popular culture and self-branding. Akane's first book was recently published, you can get it now, titled Gender and Relatability in Digital Culture, Managing Affect, Intimacy and Value. So I know they didn't want me to really do those awkward introductions, but I thought it was important given the tone of the evening and in trying to get the idea of social sciences out there. So to start us off, we're going to have a series of provocations. We're going to have 4 provocations that will structure the next 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for your questions and comments and maybe further provocations. So when you're thinking and thinking about what our panellists are saying, please keep your questions in mind. If you want to tweet us, you can tweet. My handle is @BradyJ. If you don't want to keep the questions in your brain, you can tweet them to me and I'll collect them at the end. To start off with, I want us to begin with a bit of a visual. This is someone that some of you may be familiar with, maybe not. The Cambridge Analytica scandal that really shook the way that people think about, in a mainstream way, critical of the way that social media works. This is one of the people involved in the expose and the scandal of what Cambridge Analytica is. So this is a package prepared before an ABC interview with him. I just want to play the first minute to help us frame our first provocation.
Christopher Wiley is a Canadian data analyst turned whistleblower. Last year, he sensationally exposed the misuse of Facebook data by Cambridge Analytica, a consulting firm he helped create before quitting in 2014. The company harvested the information of 87 million Facebook users through a third-party app, a seemingly innocuous personality test. It used the data to build sophisticated psychological profiles of individuals. These profiles were then used by the Trump and Vote Leave campaign to make highly targeted ads. which are thought to have influenced both elections. Wiley described it as psychological warfare. After Wiley blew the whistle, governments on both sides of the Atlantic investigated Facebook, resulting in fines including a record $7 billion penalty from the US Federal Trade Commission. Cambridge Analytica went bankrupt and has been shut down, but concerns about Facebook's grip on our data and how it's deployed by political parties are only growing.
So, Mark, how did we get here? Why is it that we have lost trust in social media?
Well, how we got here. I think I'm going to start by just asking that question, why we might trust these institutions in the first place and why we might feel betrayed by them. There are kind of two ways to think about trust when we think about social media. One is trust in the content that circulates on social media, and the other is trust in the platform or the institution itself. And it's interesting to me that these organizations, which are fundamentally commercial organizations, and something like Facebook is basically, from an industry side perspective, an advertising platform, is something that we would think about in terms of the register of trust. Why we would have surveys. We've got that survey, what's your trust in social media up there. We're less likely to see a survey like that about a major advertising company. You know, what's your trust in Omnicom? Why do we look at these institutions for trust? It's because we endow them, I think, with the notion that they have some civic function and civic purpose, and that they should have some type of a civic commitment. And I would guess that because they're information-providing platforms, that assumption comes out of the way that we think about the history of the press and journalism and information in a democratic society. So the institution that takes over the way that we see and learn about and share information is something that we historically associate with journalistic enterprises and publishing enterprises. So we think, okay, that would have some type of a civic function built in. Now, many of these companies didn't start that way and didn't see themselves as publishers. You know, like Facebook resisted the notion of seeing itself as a publisher for a long time for some regulatory reasons. So they may not see themselves the same way that we see them. And so our notion that, you know, our trust is betrayed by them or they're not functioning in the way that we think a civic institution should function has to do maybe with a certain disconnect between our expectations and the self-image of these companies and what they do. And that's something that I think we're negotiating now. At the second level, the trust in the content. This, to me, is an interesting political question because of the relationship between how information circulates and power relations. So one argument that you could make is that information institutions and media institutions have played a role in circulating dominant narratives that reinforce those that interest the folks who are in power and reproduce those stories. And that's one way in which powerful institutions and political leaders have enlisted media institutions. I think there's another dynamic that's emerging that has historical precedence, but it's taking shape in a new and interesting way in the contemporary conjuncture. And that's the use by those in power of strategic forms of sowing mistrust, right? Rather than trying to get people to trust dominant narratives and reproduce those dominant narratives, finding ways to discredit oppositional or alternative narratives. Why would that be a useful or interesting strategy? You can tell I'm shaped a little bit, I'm American, that's my accent, shaped a little bit by thinking about the Donald Trump moment, but it could also be the Brexit moment and many other moments. If you, in an era of information plenitude that's characteristic of the internet, one way of responding to all of that information out there, and particularly the possibility that there's less centralized control over information and the threat then of potentially oppositional or discrediting information that would challenge dominant narratives, is to find ways to discredit the possibility of challenging those narratives. And if you can sow mistrust in the media, if you can deploy mistrust in representation as a political strategy, what you can do is demobilize the ability to quote-unquote speak truth to power, to mobilize alternative narratives. And so when we see all of this fake news accusations and all of the pains that Trump administration and other administrations take to mobilize mistrust in media and representation, that has a political element and a strategic element that serves the interests of power. And it turns out that these platforms work very well to reinforce that particular strategy for power because, as we know, the algorithms that guide these the circulation of information on these platforms tend to privilege information that's sensational, provocative, perhaps enraging, over other priorities, such as creating an informed populace, truth. So that the platform actually fits with certain strategies of power. And I think that may be one of the reasons why we see this mobilization of distrust and also find the way in which our own public reaction to these platforms is characterized by mistrust. And I'll leave it at that because we're also going to have some discussion among the panelists. So I'll throw those out as provocations and then see what people think.
Does anyone want to respond to that? I think that's a really neat way to think about this question of trust, though, like in platforms versus in content. And there's two very different levels of that question there, isn't there? Akana, you've got your hand on the mic. That's a good sign.
Well, I just grabbed the mic. Yeah, and maybe what I'm going to say is maybe going to prompt me, Mark, to talk a bit more about how he's developed his thinking around this area. But I think part of the trust-mistrust thing is also thinking about what that trust and mistrust does, right? And that's kind of, I think, maybe what Mark is alluding to, because ultimately we all actually need to trust in something. And it is exhausting, right, to mistrust everything and to sort of rely on your own gut instincts. Actually, we require social knowledge in order to be able to, formulate our own ideas about anything. So in a way, we do need to find trust somewhere. And I think apart from the fact that platforms have been associated with the free press and so on, it is also kind of an exhausting burden on us to automatically maybe distrust some of these institutions. So it's almost not to do with questions of individual calculations of trust or not, but that sometimes we just get folded into these systems. And I wonder if most people in the room actually trust social media, really, but we still can't kind of extricate ourselves from it because it's so embedded in convenience, connection, and all these kinds of social goods that we also need.
Yeah. Does anyone want to respond to that before we move on to the next provocation? Because we're going to come back to some of these themes as we go, but...
No, I was going to say, do you want to say anything else?
Yeah.
Slightly changing tack, I guess. But first of all, to say, what Mark said. I've not really thought about it like that. That was great. I was thinking about how we focus, and this will be a theme of what I say next as well for my provocation. But to take a step back and think about losing trust in social media is one thing, but what does that mean? What are the implications of that? So when we look at that graph and we think about what happened around the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the political motivators for that were driven by Trump, people who wanted to get Brexit, these kind of things. So the political motivations were still there, and the trust in those positions by those who adhered to them in the first place remain. So it's quite interesting that we have political motivations still succeeding at the same time as we have this distrust in the activity that was taken to develop those political positions. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah. That probably leads us nicely, actually, into the next provocation, if I can go there. This question about how do you respond and how do the current institutions that we have set up around regulation and governance, how do they work when it comes to these platforms? And Mark, started us off by asking this question about why is it that we don't ask these questions of trust of other platforms or other advertising companies, for example. So, Asha, maybe we can start with you with this one. The second provocation on social media is too big to govern. Have we kind of missed an opportunity to exert some kind of control or regulation, or is there hope in terms of regulation and governance?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question, and I think we need to come at it from a multifaceted angle. So there is a concern that social media is getting too big to govern, and I was at a summit recently, an AI summit, and someone from Microsoft was there, and they were saying that the government was just falling behind. They hadn't provided good enough ethical framework or laws to sort of advance understanding in this area and respond to it. So as a result, they've created their own internal ethical standards, and therefore they're holding themselves accountable. And I thought this was really interesting, and you could see it from their perspective. They were selling it as being like, look how great we are because we've created ways to make sure what we're doing is ethical. But you start to consider then we spoke about Cambridge Analytica, so the idea of that $7 billion fine that's been faced. We saw YouTube recently, $170 million US fine for collecting data on children who are 13 years and under. So the idea that we can allow social media companies and platforms to regulate themselves, I think, is highly problematic. But we also are having trouble with the law being able to keep up with governing in this regard as well. So an example, a lot of my work has been around image-based abuse. Now, an extension of image-based abuse has been AI-facilitated abuse. So this is deep fake technologies. So some of you might have heard of this, but it's basically where they're using AI technologies to essentially give anybody the power to be able to create a realistic nude image of another person. So an example, an app was created this year in the US that you could download. It was $50, and it allowed you the opportunity to create a realistic nude image of any female to use for any purpose. It was only for women. If you uploaded a picture of a male, it was also the clothes were replaced with breasts and a vulva. So it was directly targeted at women, and it gave everybody this opportunity. So we saw this blatant commercialization of these types of technologies, and it creates a sense of what we refer to as digital drift. So the idea that perpetrators are getting access to these types of tools that you used to have to be really motivated and have the skills to be able to use, and now we're seeing it expand. But the problem, from a legal point of view, is that we're falling behind. So image-based abuse laws have been introduced across Australia, across parts of the US, the UK, and these have been a really positive movement towards kind of governing some of these key issues we're seeing. But one of the limitations, for example, in the UK laws is that they don't capture deepfake technologies because they consider that the harm to the victim is going to be less because it's not a real image. And this is ignoring the fact that these technologies are now creating, as you can see up there, incredibly lifelike outcomes. We also see that there has to be an intention to cause harm to the victim. Now, in cases like that app that I've just described to you, there might be no direct intent to cause harm to the victim. It might be something that a person is creating for their own personal use. In that regard, you might be able to say, well, what is the harm to the victim if they don't know? We accept that there's harm, but if they don't know that the image has even been created, can you still prove that there is distress, therefore, to the victim and an intention to cause harm? So our laws are falling behind as well. What we have seen, though, if you want me to keep talking just for a minute, is some really positive steps that I want to focus on as well. So we will be talking about the negative side of social media a lot tonight, but we have seen some positive advances. So at Facebook, for example, some of the key ways that they've started to respond to these types of abusive behaviours is to create a not without my consent platform, and this is where victims who might have experienced image-based abuse can go and seek support and resources. They've also started using AI technology in a really positive way so that they can start to detect images that are nude or nearly nude, and they also do an algorithm to check the type of wording and language that's accompanying that image. So if it appears to the computers that it might potentially be an abusive form of sharing of that image, they'll actually block it from being put up online. So we're starting to see some positives in that way. There's also a major project on in the US at the moment. I'm sure many of you in the room are familiar with the idea of cyber flashing or dick pics more familiar. I'm sure many of you are nodding and have probably received some of these. So one of the big concerns around dick pics, and there are many, is that airdrop is a facility that can be used to basically cyber flash you without you having any control over what's happening. So if you've got your airdrop set, this is Apple Communication Networks, if you've got your airdrop set to public, you can just receive a picture of a dick on your phone and not even have an opportunity to say, no, I don't want to see this, because it's right there. So there's a big project in the US at the moment where they're using AI technologies to be able to detect these images and prevent them from being able to be shown on your screen. And this will be done through things like Twitter, through Bumble, through Tinder, through Grindr, apps where where this type of behaviour is being seen as more readily occurring. So we are seeing some positive initiatives start to come through as well, but I guess my message is that it's not too big to govern, but we need a really large-scale, multifaceted approach to be able to try and respond to this. We can't rely on the organisations doing this themselves. We can't rely on the law alone doing this. We need education, we need prevention, we need everyone kind of coming together to think about how we can address this issue.
Did anyone else want to add in on that? I was thinking about the fines you mentioned initially, which kind of flashed up in that package from before, and like they seem like a lot of money, but they're such tiny drops in the barrel of what these platforms are making. So if this is the only kind of structure we have institutionally to force some kind of more ethical behaviour, it's very limited, isn't it?
It is, and there's so many inconsistencies. So YouTube, on the one hand, are doing something like that. On the other hand, they've been quite strong advocates against deepfake technologies. So there was the deepfake video, non-pornographic, of the US House Speaker that came out showing her appearing to be drunk while making a speech at work. And they were one of the platforms that stood up and said, we're not allowing this online because it's causing her reputational damage. We know it's fake and it's harmful. Facebook, on the other hand, said, we don't have any rules that require what you post to be true. So therefore, that we're allowing it to be liked, to be shared, and for it to continue to remain on our platform, although we acknowledge it is causing harm and it is not a true video. So even these types of inconsistencies are therefore, they're making ethical decisions themselves around what they will and will not respond to.
This GIF that's up on the screen is slightly distracting, sorry, but this is taken from a video that is on Facebook's. Facebook's essentially set up a kind of challenge to recruit people into helping them address this challenge around deepfakes, and they're setting up a big database of paid actors to help train their system to be able to detect deepfakes more easily. So I guess another question, and anyone can jump in on this, but how much should we be trusting social media platforms, companies like this, to be implementing their own solutions, given where we started with Mark's response initially? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Mark, or anyone?
We have to think about, I guess, the imperatives that govern these institutions. And what we have to concede is the main imperative is going to be an economic imperative. So finding ways to self-regulate is going to take place against the background of either public forms of concern or public forms of self-subtraction from these platforms, something that gets their bottom line, or as forms of regulation that threaten their economic incentives. As you say, I calculated how much that YouTube penalty would be. Let's say you had a take-home income of $100,000. That fine that they received of 170 million amounts to about a ticket of $400 for somebody who's got that take-home income. So, as an economic disincentive, it's probably not huge. It creates enough of a dent that they may pay attention, but it's not clear that that will necessarily be enough to change their behavior. I think, from the flip side, one of the other things that we need to think about, and I don't want to put the onus on users because that's one of the pathologies of response to social media. Well, let the users sort it out, let them figure it out. But I do think that there's a role to be played in terms of thinking about how to address the forms of attention and social media presence that people are able or response or engagement that people are able to gain through the circulation of these images. And what it means, we've already valorized in a social media context the forms of attention and popularity on the part of people themselves when they circulate this information. So you create a system in which people are incentivized in a way to behave like algorithms to maximize the attention and engagement that they receive. And I do think there's a role to be played in thinking about what are the forms of civic education and understanding that might counter some of the pathologies of this, self-branding, self-maximization that goes along with social media. But I don't want to put the onus there, but I want to say maybe these are all part of the picture.
Can I have one?
Yeah.
Quickly? Yeah, and one other thing they have done at Facebook, which reminds me, it's kind of a combination of putting a bit of the onus back on the user, but also making an effort, is a trial they did to try and prevent racial hate speech from being posted online. So what they did, unbeknownst to users, surprise, surprise. But they when you went to post something, if it was if they would identify the algorithm if it was potentially racially hateful, and a block-up would come up and it would say, we've detected that this might be potentially harmful or offensive. Do you still wish to post it? And the results came back and they had found like around 30% of people didn't post it, around 30% turned it, reworded it to often something equally as hateful, but still reworded it, and the rest just posted as it was. But they saw that as kind of a positive way to start looking at how they can at least be challenging that initial kind of throwback to say, hang on, this is offensive. And I thought that was, a relatively good start, a bit of a way of kind of looking at that civic responsibility as well.
Can I just jump in and actually ask a question of Asha? So this kind of, both your and Mark's comments made me think of how it's really important to take into mind people's own mindsets about what they consider to be harmful, right? Because in some ways, law reform has trailed behind, feminist pushes for what is seen as harmful, and that's taken a while. So how do you see that kind of playing out, I guess? Do you think that the law can lead the way because sometimes some people, discount some of the forms of harm that are enabled through digital technologies?
I'm just checking your time. Yeah. No, I don't think the law can lead the way. I think that society has to ultimately lead the way. But I do think the law is a really important vehicle for change and for helping shape community norms and acceptable practice. So by having laws, we're saying, we as a society are saying this is not okay, this type of behaviour is not condoned. But I think we can't rely on the law to be the only person that's advocating these types of messages because the rules of evidence, the type of procedure that you have to apply to legal frameworks is very different to how we might interpret harm among ourselves as opposed to how we would prove harm in a court. But I do think that it does have a strong role to play. We need to look at, in a sense, how we can start to understand what some of the potentials of these types of technologies are. I'm talking specifically here about image-based abuse and deepfake technologies, to think about not how we can future-proof, because you can't future-proof, but ways that we can start to think about, well, what's the next step in this technology going to be and how can we start to do that? And whether that's things like developing technologies, so any like a public photo that you might put up somehow has, something technical within it so that if someone tries to manipulate that image in any way, it's going to come out looking funny on the screen or on a video. So little things like that we can start to do and even put an onus on, say, institutions like Monash, for example. Any public photo they release of us as a Monash branded thing should have that type of technology built into it so people can't be grabbing our images online and doing something with them. Things around that nature.
Let's change tack slightly and move on to our third provocation, which opens a big kettle of fish for us. And I'm going to ask Steve to respond initially to this one. But social media has contributed to the rise of populism and the alt-right. So this moves us away, I guess, from the kind of content or trust in terms of thinking about platforms and more into thinking about the material that's circulated on social media platforms. So, Steve, do you want to have a crack at responding to this one first?
Before I get to the serious stuff, I notice we're at a social media seminar. I'm the only one using my phone with my prompts. But anyway, I really like this prompt, actually, because it speaks to some ideas in sociology that are core to the sociological enterprise. So, for example, there's a guy, Pierre Bourdieu, talks about sociology should be a myth buster. It also speaks to this idea of moral panic as well, which I won't go into in too much detail. But what I think we need to do to get at this question is to take a step back to start with, and to think about what we mean, what is populism and the alt-right. And the conclusion that I'm going to come to, I think, is that in a way, the provocation, which is seductive. I know that political and media commentators say this kind of stuff, probably without evidence sometimes, but it's seductive. And I think the cart is before the horse, but that's not without saying that social media is very powerful in spreading influential messages, both positive and negative. But I want to take a step back and think, right, so what is populism and the alt-right? Well, they're political responses. They're responses to social and economic situations, and they're narratives that people follow, develop, imbibe. And I think that's really important, because what it starts to tell us is that another core job of sociology is we look to history. And in history, we've seen this before, just not with social media platforms. So we know in Melbourne, well, some people know in Melbourne in the 1920s, as a reaction to the rise of communism and the Bolshevik Revolution, there was the start-up of anti-communist groups and right-wing, beginnings of right-wing kind of narratives and groupings. Similarly, in the 1930s, there was pro-Mussolini type groups kicking around in Melbourne as well. If we fast forward to the 1970s, we have the rise of skinheads both here, and I'm from the UK, and even though I was only born at the end of the 70s, the narrative was around the rise of right-wing groups and this phenomenon called Paki bashing, which I was lucky to avoid. And the point I'm making here is that, yeah, we've seen these things before, and the drivers are social and economic in structure and nature. So I think we have to be a bit careful about what we're saying in terms of the rise of the right. Now, the contemporary rise of the right and populism is driven by the fact that many people have limited access to secure employment, the pressures that come from migration and immigration specifically is framed as a problem and a solution, I suppose, for the alt-right. And in the contemporary era, that has been given a voice through social media. And social media has created platforms for us to have discussions in echo chambers. So if we're of that mind that we are under pressure and our job is being taken by this brown-skinned person who's come into this country, then we talk to people in these echo chambers that social media has provided. It's also provided a space or platform, I guess, for celebrities of sorts that espouse these populist and alt-right right-wing narratives and discourses, so people like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro and many others. And they have, given a voice and become celebrities in their own right. So we've got this powerful circulation of negative populist and alt-right narratives. Now, so they exist. Now, what the research tells us actually is there is a relationship and in terms of radicalization. So I think what I'm trying to say is the seed of this stuff is there, the underbelly is there, and it emerges in the right circumstances. Now, some very, very recent research from Cornell University in the US from the beginning of September, which did an analysis of 79 million YouTube comments and 2 million YouTube recommendations. And what it showed was that people who were conventionally attracted to the alt-light and programs and videos associated with Jordan Peterson and so on, sometimes described as the intellectual dark web. It's like this group of people who think they're the truth sayers and, you know, trying to say what is right in the world, and are usually really regressive. Those videos had a direct link to radicalizing people and pushing them towards properly alt-right, right-wing narratives. So we know there's a relationship that it can further radicalize people. However, the last thing I wanted to say was that there are still some spaces where, again, on this theme of positivity, we should think about the way that there is contestation as well. So there are echo chambers, but the research that Brady mentioned at the beginning, which is my new book, which comes out soon, please buy it. So we analysed the YouTube gaming community, our gaming. So the video gaming community is notorious, certainly by anecdote, for being the kind of place where you're going to get hypersexism and all kinds of bad stuff, right? It's a breeding ground for the right wing. And what's interesting about the analysis is that, yes, there is a significant minority of really hostile, horrible content that you probably wouldn't want to read about, actually. But the most interesting thing, as well as there being a lot of content that's kind of gender neutral and people actually just talking about gaming, surprise, gamers just like games as well, there's masses of contestation. And we very rarely point to the contestation. We very rarely point to those parts of social media where people are gathering and saying, no, this is unacceptable. And I think we need to get that balance kind of right when we address this question.
Yeah, lots in there to respond to. Does anyone want to respond to anything Steve said? Akane? Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting, and there is always that delicate balancing act because obviously social media does attract a very kind of, lots of polarising views. People like to blame social media for everything. But at the same time, I think it is also important to think about social media's changing the cultural fabric. So, I mean, not just social and economic, because we can see there are particular portions of the population. We all live in, under similar economic conditions, but there are particular portions of the population that are more interested in alt-right discourse, etc. And there's some really amazing work by, for example, this amazing feminist media scholar, Sarah Benet-Weiser, who's also coming to visit Monash, so keep your eye out for that, but who talks about this interesting relationship between popular misogyny, so the alt-right, and popular feminism. And she talks about how this is a very mediated thing, so not just with roots in social and economic issues, but the way in which we can see that, feminism, for example, has suddenly become very visible through media. It's kind of everywhere. It's very visible, very popular in some ways. It's aligned with branding. There's a sense that feminism is gaining this ascendancy because it has so much visibility without really being necessarily rooted in institutional structures and social structures more generally. So what she basically argues is that the alt-right or popular misogyny attacks this seemingly mainstreaming of feminism, saying they're increasingly marginalised. And that occurs through media culture, right? This sense that feminism is suddenly okay and cool and, Beyonce and etc. So there's this kind of interesting thing also where they kind of borrow lots of discourses from feminism ideas, so things like empowerment, like saying that, men in this particular context who have been privileged now have less power because women are arguing that they're so empowered they can do anything, right? And that's a literal reading from what a lot of popular feminism says. So I think there are lots of battlegrounds that occur across media as well in making, alt-right messages and ideas more convincing and persuasive to people as well.
Does anyone want to respond any further before we move on to our last provocation? We'll hold on to the microphone, Akane. We want to end on a somewhat optimistic tilt, I suppose. We've talked a lot about the negative, and Steve has already alluded to some of those points of contestation. We want to think about what are the kind of hopeful stories here, and indeed, what are some of the practical, approaches to thinking through these questions of trust. And all throughout we've been discussing, the way in which we think about platforms, social media platforms, as these kind of guardians of our, personal records, our personal lives. So maybe the question is moving away from whether or not we trust the platforms themselves and more to thinking about actual practices of social media use. So, Akane, I wonder if you can respond first to this provocation about whether or not there is hope.
Well, Mark and I were just joking before about how we're both very negative people. So,
Right.
But I think it's useful. Of course, there's always hope. There's always the possibility for positive change. But I think that we have to, really take a pragmatic approach to thinking about the positive and the negative. So in some ways, for example, so one area that I research is sort of everyday feminism and how it's connected with digital cultures. So in a way, I'm a feminist, so you would think that I would be filled with hope and really, I think, gain a lot of reassurance from online everyday feminism. But what a lot of my participants have reported in talking about how they deal with digital culture shows, I think, some of the real challenges of social media that we need to address. And they're not just to do with trolls, alt-right, etc., but they're due to sort of these everyday cultures of surveillance and judgment, for example, that they see a lot in what's going on. So what we know is that social media it's very accessible, which is great, but it also provides spaces where people are much more easily judged on what they put forward. And those textual responses are replicable, they can last for a long time. It creates a lot of anxieties for how people can act, and that kind of anxiety itself can lead to a loss of trust. Another thing that I found really interesting is that while in many ways I'm quite inspired by what a lot of my feminist participants are trying to do in championing intersectional feminism as a kind of broader interlocking set of responses to oppressions, there's also, I think, a lot of judgment and confusion about intersectionality itself. So while people, and this is very much part of, I think, a lot of hashtag culture and meme culture, are able to cite Kimberly Crenshaw as being the originator of this term, it's circulated so often that it's lost any connection with its context. And that was something actually that Kimberly Crenshaw wrote herself in 2013, that a lot of people are very easily able to cite something through social media, but they've lost sense of a kind of a context, historical context for what something might mean. So I think that in terms of thinking through, I guess, the pragmatics is, I guess having a fair idea of what we all can do. So for one thing, yes, definitely as discussed before, it's really unfair for social media platforms to push the labour of content moderation, etc., onto individual users, since they themselves have created the problem of being able to inundate each other with information. But, they can try to push it onto us. But I think there's also things we can do. So if we think about social media as not just the platforms, but a set of prosthetics, something that are part of us, that extend the practices that we already engage in, that are part of our own mindsets, then I think we can start thinking about the ways we might shift our practices through social media and if those are helpful or not. So one thing might be, I think, trying to really be careful and be generous when we have online discussion and not just automatically think this person is the most problematic, horrible person in the world. To try and think about how people are really trying to learn and improve through social media, and to take care, I think, in the ways in which we also adopt these practices of having faith in social media that are not as helpful. So some might be in relation to faith in the power of prediction, so believing that data and masses of data will deliver us what we need. We can see that with things like Brexit and the recent Australian election, that prediction didn't really work out as planned. Maybe also if you're in different institutions or companies, think about data collection as a practice. So we all as academics collect data, but think about, do we really need all these identity details? Do we need to, trawl and scrape in the same way that social media platforms do? Do we need this power over people's identities? I'll probably finish there because I'm rambling a bit.
Yeah, that's really good. Does anyone want to respond to that before I open up for questions or comments more generally?
Just one quick thing, and that's to say this comes back to the issue of the legal framework, I suppose, that from next year, I believe, like I can't remember the exact name of the law, but things are going to change, and actually as researchers we will not be able to, without the consent of individuals, to take that data at the individual personal level. So there is scope for the legal framework to help, well, at least prevent researchers from abusing the material, but perhaps we're not the people that one should be worried about.
I think something happened on this just today. I don't know if anyone else is across this, but I think there was an appeal against this for research purposes. But yeah, it's and in terms of research ethics, like, we want this to be more public-facing, so we don't want to get into a discussion about academic research ethics, but there is a huge set of questions there in how we do what we do. So I'm really keen to hear your thoughts, your questions. What has this prompted for you? Do you have your own provocations or things that you want to know, specific questions that have come up for you? And I will kind of say that this is recorded at this point, so if you want to ask a question or make a comment, that will go into the recording. Due warning.
Hi everyone, thanks for the panel discussion. My question, I guess, relates to three of you, but when we research topics like, revenge porn, masculinities and gaming culture online and feminism online, and if you're publicly writing about this, whether or not it's from a research academic perspective or from like a journalism perspective or any other kind of commentary, obviously we put ourselves out there in a vulnerable position where the people and the abuses that we're discussing might suddenly discover that we exist. So what kind of level of trust, if you can reflect on this, do you have with either the institutions you're writing for, the platforms you're writing on, or any other kind of legal parameters that exist out there, that you will be protected in the work that you do and continue to do?
Yeah, thank you for that. Look, this is a really challenging question and a challenging issue. I think I want to reflect on, and she was pictured in the images up there, Noelle Martin, who has been an incredible campaigner for making changes to image-based abuse, revenge porn laws. She was a victim of it herself, and a photoshopped image of her from Facebook was put onto pornographic images, and then it sort of went from there. Since she's come out and been a huge campaigner and advocate for saying why this is a problem, she's now become a victim of ongoing abuse, and this has included more significant deepfake technologies being used to create her in pornographic images. She won a award, Young WA of the Year award, and she was holding her award, and they replaced that with her holding something else, and photoshopped her onto these different types of images. So this is a huge problem. But from my perspective, I think that ultimately what we're trying to do is drive awareness and change in these spaces, and we do have the security of coming at it from an institutional perspective and having the support and backing of our institution, which does put us in a position of privilege. But it's an opportunity to be able to share the stories and the lived experiences of people who have gone through this, who might not otherwise have the opportunity to have their voices heard. And sitting in our ivory towers, if you like, we really can have that direct voice to governments and to industries to try and tell them why we need these changes. So it is risky and it is challenging, but from my perspective, ultimately, someone needs to be standing up and expressing these opinions and trying to enact change for the better of society and for people who otherwise wouldn't have the voice or platform to do it.
I'd also just add to that I benefit from the patriarchal dividend, right? I'm embarrassed to say that, but my female colleagues put themselves out there in a much more significant way. And those who have alt-right leanings mobilise in a particular way to attack women. So like, I'm very proud to work with the kinds of people that I do, and I feel sorry for them, of course, as well, because I'm somehow inoculated from some of that stuff. But I take Ash's point that we have to take a stand, and we use our institutional backing to try to do that. But that's not to say that we're not going to come in for some shit, basically.
Hello, thank you so much for speaking. My name's Marissa. I had a question for you, actually. This is kind of a tangential question. We'll see who jumps at answering it first. But it's kind of about, I agree with your point around how we can't rely on the institutions to govern themselves. But I also have a question about when social media becomes too governed. So one of the slides was social media is too big to govern. And a lot of the talk has been around AI and image-based abuse, which I do some research in as well. My PhD is on feminist activist Instagram artists, and they represent transgressive kind of representations of women's bodies online, menstruation, childbirth, many different things in artistic ways. And a lot of them actually experience a lot of shadow banning from these new AI technologies and algorithms. And they lose their Instagram accounts, which is their main business and how they get money. So it's actually something through my interviews that I've been toying with, because I agree that social media needs to be governed to protect people. However, there's a lot of contestation between my participants who use Instagram as their main business to sell their art in the representation of the female body. They actually believe that Instagram is governed too much in a misogynistic way, in that women's bodies in artistic form are taken down and they're being shadow banned, because obviously there are reasons to not represent nude women online, but for these artistic reasons they feel it's being governed in a misogynistic way at the moment. So I kind of wanted to get your opinions on that, on reflecting on how it's being governed currently and when it becomes too governed.
I'll go first and then hand it over. Yeah, look, we've also seen it's a really important point, so thank you for raising it. And it is something we've seen. There was the recent breast cancer campaign where women who had their breasts removed wanted to have the opportunity to highlight this online, and they weren't able to do this, and they were shut down by Facebook and Instagram, saying that it was offensive content. And I think this comes back to what Akane was saying as well about the idea of how we determine what is harmful and what's offensive. It's also highlighting the importance of why we cannot solely rely on computers and algorithms to be making the kind of decisions that humans need to be involved in. So while there's that element of wanting to avoid, having hundreds of, particularly Indian women, it has been a huge problem sitting in a room with graphic content, just having to deal and process that. We do need some kind of, computer intervention in there to avoid having people exposed to that. But we do need to have humans ultimately making these decisions and taking into account what is and isn't harmful content. And I think these are really important points because, the depiction of a female body is not a negative thing. It's not a harmful or offensive thing in the context that you're talking about. Of course, it can be used in very devastating ways that we've seen in my research.
Yeah, I think that, those are all really great points and, really fantastic question. It's a really big one, but I would just say I think it maybe depends on how we're governed, because we're always governed to some extent, but I think there's a question of how are those decisions made about what's, offensive or not. And what we can see with, current content moderation practices across platforms that do push a lot of those questions onto individual users to report or flag. Often those, when the windows pop up or whatever, they don't even really allow for a very nuanced reason to say why you find something offensive. I mean, maybe it is a naked woman's body in a particular way, or that's not presented in an aesthetically pleasing way, and so it's offensive. I mean, there's lots of women's bodies that aren't clothed very much on billboards, etc., but for some reason when it's not done to in a particular way, it's considered not right. So there is some like research about this in terms of saying, well, how do we maybe strike a balance in not just have these sort of flagging practices, but how might we have actual discussions about what's considered problematic as well? I mean, I don't agree that those images are problematic, but how might we have those discussions and not just flag them and hide them, but also have space to discuss why is this offensive, in what context, what are the reasons you might want to, you know, put forward nudity in this particular context as a form of activism.
I can't promise this will come out in the form of a question, so find it in there. I was just musing, I guess, on trust that we talked about initially, and to Akane's point around convenience and the social capital that people find in social media. Are we actually seeing trust and the loss of trust changing behaviour? Is trust for social media users anything more than a survey question? Are they thinking about trust when they're not being asked about it?
We all looked at Mark.
Yeah. No pressure.
I thought Akane's point was quite interesting in terms of thinking about trust is something that we can't dispense with. So the interesting question is, where does it go, or how does it get reconfigured? And one of the things that I think we're seeing, and I think Akane gestured in this direction, is on the one hand a strategic mobilization of mistrust in representation, what we're familiar with in terms of fake news being circulated and so on. And at the same time, the question of, all right, well, where does trust go, or how does it get reconfigured in that case? And one of the ways that we can see it taking place is, what if you don't trust the media, or you don't trust in the historical practices and institutions that we have relied on in the past to affirm what we think a truth narrative or historically accurate narrative is? Where does trust go? And Akane said this interesting phrase, kind of gut instinct or response. You know, what does it? Those folks who, when Donald Trump, circles the part of Alabama that was, supposed to that he claimed was going to get hit by Hurricane Dorian. The people who know that he's lying about these things, there's another level or element of trust. The people who support him, who say things like, well, it doesn't really matter what he said, or the media are manipulating this, or I don't even believe the coverage of this, I think this is fake. But I have some other form of trust, which is quite a profound form of trust. Despite what all of the representations that I see, I have a kind of instinctive sense of connection. And that version of trust is an interesting one, in the sense that it's not amenable to the forms of evidentiary-based argument that we associate with public deliberation. It just can't be reached by that. And that's a little bit alarming, in the sense that the forms of evidence and deliberation and debate and discussion were implemented to negotiate conflicts and disagreements in ways that circumvented violence. If you don't have those forms of negotiating difference and disagreement in place, and you default to something that's not amenable to them, the question then becomes, how do you negotiate forms of disagreement or conflict? And that's not really an answer to the question, as far as I know. But I guess the best I can say is, trust, it can't be disappearing. It's being rechanneled and reworking itself in ways. And in the ways in which it's getting reworking are things that we need to attend to and figure out what the consequences of that might be. Yeah. Oh, yes.
One very quick question, only because you're the boss.
Really, and I just wonder about the, thank you, Mark, about the intimacy of social media. And so, there's something about the intimacy that overrides the evidentiary, that you trust your friends. That's who's peppered through social media, your friends, your family. And maybe Donald Trump talks to these people as though he's their friend. That kind of the immediacy, the direct conversation, something about that intimacy is very boundary crossing, and I thought what you said about it being really exhausting to not trust is insightful there. But anyway, it's a half-formed thought. But do you think that the intimacy is relevant?
I'll just be really quick, but yeah, absolutely. I think intimacy is just a huge part of the fabric of social media and why they're drawn to it and why it's so everyday and part of the real benefit, right, that we gain from it. I think in relation to the trust question that Mark answered, I think there's something about, okay, so again, where does that trust go and how is it reconfigured? And there's part of this sort of, cultural context where we're told you can't trust all these people, you can't trust the media, you can't trust elites, you can't trust all these other strangers or academics. You can trust yourself, like rely on yourself, rely on your gut instinct. And that ends up translating into believing that your friends, family, etc., are, somehow impermeable to these broader social knowledges and facts, so that you and people like you know what's best. And while I do think it's important, absolutely, to have confidence in yourself and, rely on feeling in some ways to judge what's appropriate, what's right, and, etc., I think it is dangerous to think that you make those decisions in a social vacuum.
We'll probably have to end on that note. I can smell the food. You can probably smell the food as well. Please join me in thanking our panellists, Akane, Steve, Asher and Mark.